Hey folks, this is Jeremy. You're about to hear part of a three-parter episode that we recorded with Derick Varn. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, you can do so right now by heading to patreon.com/givingthemic.
How hyped are you about Avengers Endgame?
Pretty hyped.
All right.
See, there we go. Asked and answered.
That was the question.
Yeah, okay, cool. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You are welcome once again to Giving the Mic to the Wrong Person. I am your host, Jeremy. Joining us on a rainy but somewhat better early spring evening here in Portland, Oregon, is we have Jacob here in the room and returning champion Derick Varn on the other end of the horn. Say hi to the viewing audience, Derick.
Hello.
Thank you. Derick, could you give a quick introduction to yourself to anybody who may or probably is not a first-time listener, but you never know?
I am a teacher, a poet, and I guess a editor, and someone dare say I'm a theorist, although that word is so vague it doesn't really mean anything. I work for Zero Books. I work at an international school in Utah, which I will not name, and I work at Former People, which is a literary journal which I co-founded. And in reference to this, I used to teach a course. I no longer teach it on analyzing conspiracy theories. And I kind of feel like I lived through the height of the second wave of left-wing conspiracy theories, because I'm of the age of left-wing truthers before that was solely ceded to the Alex Jones crowd.
Modernity happens in odd ways.
Yep.
And join us in studio. Would you say hello to the nice people?
Hello to the nice people.
Yes, Jacob's here too.
Everybody's out to get me, but that's okay.
Hey, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you.
Yep. I'm used to it.
There we go. But Derick, I wanted to have you on here because you had mentioned that you would I would listen to one of the talks that you'd had with previous guest J.G. Michael on your alternative show, and I wanted to see, because this has been, like I said, it's been a topic that we've been covering for on and off for a little while. But I figured since you can actually teach this stuff, I wanted to see if you could just say it's like we are effectively, we are auditing your intro lecture on the class. And, please go right ahead.
All right. So if you were in my class, I'd be talking to you first of all about like 2 or 3 theories of parsimony. Now you generally hear about the parsimonious argument as Occam's razor. I don't love that argument because it's not really an argument. It is the assertion that the simplest answer is most likely to be correct, but it doesn't necessarily give you a solid definition for what is simple.
Right. Also, what could you define what's your definition of parsimony?
Parsimony is something that has the least number of parts should be the heuristic you use to gauge the most likely answer. It is not anything but a probable answer.
Gotcha.
So nothing that I'm going to teach anyone is going to debunk a conspiracy theory. And frankly, I'm not super interested in that. For one, there's like a million podcasts or whatever you can go to do that. And for two, it's pretty much impossible to do in a way that would come to anything like,
something that would permanently change somebody's mind as opposed to maybe partially nudging them in a particular direction? Correct.
I mean, changing people's mind honestly isn't even a logical exercise, frankly. It's a rhetorical one. So, but the problem when we talk about conspiracy theory thinking is that it's a really broad category, and there are actual conspiracies. I mean, COINTELPRO happened, the Church Committee unlocked all kinds of stuff. And actually, when I teach this class, the first thing I mention is you can kind of use what you found out in the church commissions and the declassifications in the 70s as a baseline for the most expansive conspiracies. So the things that have the most effect. And a couple of things you'll realize pretty quickly. My first rule of parsimony, if it can be explained by one or two people being incompetent and covering their tracks, it is more likely to be true than if it is explained by malice. You can think of some of the experiments in the LSD experiments.
Mid-60s CIA kind of like fumbling around stuff.
Most of that's hidden because it really didn't do anything, and it just makes them look silly. Also, remote viewing is another example of that. That was classified for a long time because it's kind of silly. So that's kind of simple. So when you encounter, say, a series of conspiracy theories, like the mob killed JFK versus the CIA killed JFK versus the Standard story versus, let's say, a conspiracy theory that I think is plausible, although I don't know how plausible it is that in firing back to Oswald, one of the Secret Service members actually did accidentally shoot the president, and that is why the discrepancies are there, right? So I wouldn't even necessarily put that one at a 50% likelihood, but if I was just going on priors from what I've learned looking at like church committee declassified stuff, that one would be quasi likely, as opposed to, I don't know, anything that involves more than 5 people. Okay, that's the first one. Second one, you can kind of throw that out during wartime. So, like, while I think false flags are dramatically overclaimed,
we do have some on the record.
Yeah, they happen. They're real.
I'm thinking about incubators during Iraq.
Right. If it only requires one person in front of a congressional testimony, you can almost be certain it's probably propaganda. I mean, you can see that right now, right? The debates over what happened to the aid in Venezuela.
Aid in scare quotes, yeah.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is blocking life-saving humanitarian aid from getting into his collapsing country. Humanitarian aid, humanitarian aid, humanitarian aid, humanitarian aid, humanitarian aid.
Yeah, aid, right? You can also assume that the State Department probably is funneling money for the CIA. That's kind of like, there's such a strong historical pattern there. And diplomats are so commonly part of the intelligence services of a country, not just in the U.S., that if you hear that, you can assume it's true. But you can also assume it's true for the other side. And frankly, historically speaking, the other side is probably more competent with less money. You can think about all the stuff the CIA and the NKVD, could pull off for good and ill. Versus what the CIA could pull off. Fourth rule: this is not a rule of parsimony. This is just a historical heuristic.
Wait, wouldn't this be the third rule?
Oh yeah, sorry. Third rule: this is not a rule of parsimony. This is a historical heuristic. Intelligence agencies like to have some hands in all baskets. So no matter who wins a conflict, they have some pool. So, for example, if you look at, say, the Cuban Revolution, you can find United States money going to both the Batista government and even the Castro government, depending on the time and who they're trying to win over. This is historically factual in the sense that it's not even classified anymore. So why would you do that? Well, the CIA kind of has like not a bad investor, a conservative investor's mentality to how it approaches social movements.
They want to hedge their bets.
Yeah, I mean they want to hedge their bets.
Well, and even beyond that, it's a decently sized organization that has an aggressive policy toward secrecy and classification. So I don't think it's entirely shocking that sometimes one hand doesn't know what the other is doing.
That's also true. Another thing is historically speaking, if you look at, for example, COINTELPRO and left and right wing groups, and I've studied both, but both what they have done and has been declassified in regards to the stuff in the 60s, like with the Panthers, and stuff they have done with people like George Lincoln Rockwell, the founder of the American Nazi Party. One of the biggest things there is they tend to encourage people who are ideologically driven legitimately to spy. For example, one of the main sources of information on George Lincoln Rockwell to the FBI, does not CIA here, was a person who was also kind of set up to be a communist spy. I mean, the spy on the Communist Party in America. If you want to read about that, it's in some of the beginning chapters of the book For Race and Nation. More commonly, the book Heavy Radicals, which Zero published, and I'm not plugging it because we published it, because its sequel is from a different press, and I suggest people read both. Can't remember the sequel's name right now, but it's about the Revolutionary Communist Party and COINTELPRO's actions there. And what you discover there is that COINTELPRO, all it really did was encourage people to do what they were going to do or to voice their dissension louder. When people get killed, and this is even true in the case of the Panthers where they were much more aggressive, it's because they tend to involve local law enforcement who tends to be a little bit more gun happy.
Funny that.
So, for example, the RCP, one of the stings on the RCP was a local sting trying to mimic COINTELPRO stings, and it screwed up, and one of the RCP members was shot and killed by undercover cop. I believe that was in 1981. But prior to that, for 20 years, COINTELPRO had been completely throughout the organization monitoring them because they felt that the RCP was in league with Communist China and trying to take over the SDS, which, to be frank, was true. So that's not surprising. What is more surprising, though, is how much further they went. And, this is where I tend to be more sympathetic to Native American and African American conspiracy theorists.
Certainly, yeah. Much better documented and, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many of them that we have hard records for. But for example, what COINTELPRO did with the Panthers was much more aggressive, including like running arms to Aoki in the Bay Area as a pretext to be able to crack down on them. It actually didn't really work, but and that was a super big scandal recently because it was released after Aoki died. I believe in 2012 or 2011, somewhere in there.
We begin today's show with explosive new allegations that the man who gave the Black Panther Party some of its first firearms and weapons training was an undercover FBI informant in California. Richard Aoki was an early member of the Panthers and the only Asian American to have a formal position in the party. He was also a member of the Asian American Political Alliance that was involved in the Third World Liberation Front student strike. The claim that Aoki was informed on his colleagues is based on statements made by a former agent of the FBI in a report obtained by investigative journalist Seth Rosenfeld, author of the new book Subversives, the FBI's War on Student Radicals and Reagan's Rise to Power.
And he was a left-wing hero in the Bay Area and in Oakland until it was outed that, he was not just, government front, but he was actually running guns as a pretext for the government to clamp down on them. So that stuff is simple, but it goes back to my rule of parsimony. You don't have to have a lot of people to hide that. You need one or two informants. If there's only one or two informants involved, and that's all you really need, the likelihood of it being true seems to go up pretty significantly. Not 100%, like nothing's 100%. You can't. All these things are kind of hypotheticals, but kind of using a layman's version of Bayesian analysis, just figuring out priors. That those conspiracies are at least possible, if not probable.
Right. Can we quick side note? Can we do a quick? You explain Bayesian analysis really quick, because that was one of the, I know that was definitely one of the topics that I did want to bring up in our discussion tonight.
Bayesian is where you kind of predict probabilities based on priors. And priors are just other events historically where this has happened. So you look at, the number of X things that we have had of this type. You look at the number of instances that confirm to your hypothesis. You figure out a ratio, and you can figure out a ratio of priors. Like in, say 100 cases, we have 25 prior instances of this happening. Therefore, there's like a 1 in 4 chance it could be possible. That's very, very, very rough Bayesian. It gets much more complicated than that. But for people who don't have extensive mathematical models in front of them, that's how you kind of figure it out.
Right, rough rubric. Yeah.
So we have two theories of parsimony. We have also the simplicity, the number of people involved. We have do not assume malice except in wartime. In wartime, that goes up dramatically. But also, the longer, if it's, this is a little bit complicated, but if it's less than 150 years ago, but more than, say, 75, it should probably be declassified by now for something to have leaked about it.
Funny,
if the government did it.
Yeah.
So
I would
anything longer than that, there's no records. But
I would point out that some of the JFK records are still classified.
That's true. And also the classification links are pretty long. I suspect, for example, there'll be elements of the 9/11 report, of some of the back end of the 9/11 reports we won't see for way after our deaths. That does not mean that I'm a truther, but
what would they possibly have to hide about 9/11?
I don't know. Maybe Saudi Arabia's involvement.
What?
Well, that is the thing. Yeah, that's the one thing. That is the like Michael Moore brought up is like, yeah, hey, wait a minute, how come this particular family got flown out?
In the days following September 11th, all commercial and private airline traffic was grounded.
The FAA has taken the action to close all of the airports in the United States.
Even grounding the president's father, former President Bush, on a flight forced to land in Milwaukee.
Thousands of travelers were stranded, among them Ricky Martin, due to appear at tonight's Latin Grammy Awards.
Not even Ricky Martin could fly. But really, who wanted to fly? No one. Except the Bin Ladens.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Moore's not a hard truther by any stretch of the imagination, but he is. There are inconsistencies in the report.
Yeah, I mean, it was deliberate. That's the thing; it was deliberately limited, now, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so when I tell people that, when you look at that, what do you jump to? You don't jump to the most expansive conspiracy theory. You jump to the meagerest one, which is we want to hide Saudi involvement because it's politically sensitive and we have interest in the region, directly related to arms sales and other things that we were doing at the time. Because like the Saudi Arabian relationship to Ba'athist is complicated, and
shockingly still ongoing.
Oh yeah,
yeah. What's the expression? It's something like, if you hear hoofbeats, do you think of zebras?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you go to what you have the historical priors for. Now, these kind of three rough rules, and they're kind of interrelated, get you on governmental conspiracies. When you get into like business conspiracies, it's a little bit more murky, because collusion is always profitable.
Well, and because businesses have no need to declassify information.
Right. So, and you're also right, like businesses do not, they have no need to even keep records for a lot of things. So that's also a lot more murky, but business conspiracies aren't as sexy as governmental conspiracies, frankly, even amongst left-wingers. So, there's that.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, because the betrayal of trust isn't there as much, frankly, because I don't think most people trust, even right-wingers don't really trust businesses. I mean, they say they do, but they don't act like they do. So I think people kind of baseline assume that businesses are crooked. So,
well, I think part of it is also just the fact that conspiracy theorists do like evidence. They don't necessarily have the best rules for their evidence, but it's rare for me to meet somebody who has wild conspiracies based on nothing. Some of them may base it on dumb, insane things, like the fact that Trump said a sentence that was 17 words, therefore he must be involved with QAnon or something like that. But they don't just make stuff up whole cloth, usually, in my experience. Whereas with this business stuff, we can kind of speculate that there's something there, but in a lot of cases, we really just don't know.
Right, and there also is no need for elaborate codes. There's no need. So when you look at business conspiracies, the best way to spot them is statistical irregularities, which is also not as sexy. Numbers do not have the same narrative power as facts that are easy to narrativize, which is kind of my four factual thing that I talk about them is statistical conspiracies and things that show up in irregularities in markets and statistics are in some ways actually easier to find in abstract, but they just don't have the same narrative power because we think in terms of narrative that's kind of easy to explain. And when it comes to dealing with large-term trends or even specific conspiracies, that's not always in our favor.
Can you give an example of the statistical irregularity?
Enron.
Okay, yeah.
Anytime where you see expansion is going at 130% larger than the growth of, say, the market at the time, which at the time would have been 1.5% nationally. That's almost impossible except in a brand new field.
And they were based in Portland.
Right.
They just had offices in Portland.
So, how they were doing that, I mean, that's a kind of collusion where you're inflating your possible profits off of maximum and then, hedging your bets against it. And only part of that was even technically illegal. So,
I wonder why. I wonder if that's not why election fraud isn't a bigger thing. I've read some stuff by Greg Palast in particular, who makes some pretty shocking allegations, but it seems like unless you have something that's obviously cartoonish, like somebody telling somebody to throw out ballots, or a situation with somebody like Maduro where 1 million people voted more than there should have been, nobody really seems to care, even if it's numerically obvious that something just totally fraudulent happened.
Oh, yeah.
Well, growing allegations of voter suppression are emerging in the hard-fought race for governor in Georgia. Polls show the contest between Republican Brian Kemp, who is Secretary of State, and Democrat Stacey Abrams is basically a dead heat. Civil rights groups are suing Kemp for putting more than 53,000 voter registration applications on hold, mostly from minority voters. And Monday, dozens of black senior citizens southeast of Atlanta were ordered off a bus bound for the polls for early voting.
I used to think about that. I followed Greg Palast during the aughts, and I think maybe he overconcludes, but he had some pretty good points about weird trends that you could see. And for a lot of, depending on your locality, like my home state doesn't have paper ballots for anything. There's no printouts. And die vote machines are 15 years old and very easy to hack. They were pretty much all installed off of laws that were created after the 2000 election, the 99 2000 election with Al Gore, and that's when the electronic voting system stuff was enacted because there's a ton of federal money put to it right then, and there's been almost none since. And there's also tons of legal conspiracies, like the way gerrymandering's done, the way voter initiatives are played out, those are conspiratorial. People are colluding, but they're not illegal. So there's not really a whole lot you can do anyway, even though they obviously are in violation of the spirit of the law. But the spirit of the law is not really what matters.
Right.
And so, I actually a lot of times get kind of frustrated, and here I'm not even talking about structural inequities, which I think people should be paranoid about, because systems work in ways that don't require people to have malice or even incompetence. They just kind of self-perpetuate once they get started, which is one of these things when trying to disaggregate conspiracies, and this is my fifth thing, it gets really difficult, is can something be explained by force of habit or a hidden systemic bias or a hidden systemic structural thing? And I'll give you an example. Like, when I worked in insurance, I realized that minority neighborhoods still got disproportionately charged for all kinds of things by they got rated higher on this and that. They got hit harder by crime rates. The actuarial tables did not account for race. But you know what set all that up? Trends that are effects related to redlining. Like, even once you stopped redlining formally, those neighborhoods would still show up as having those problems on any kind of actuarial table. So they get hit with harder fees and disproportionate loan rates and all this other stuff that is structural. Now, originally it wasn't structural. Originally it was explicitly set up under the law. But even when you remove that barrier, it can self-perpetuate. It could self-perpetuate in a society, frankly, that was even run by that minority. Like, when I worked at unnamed insurance company, we actively hired minority actuaries. It didn't change anything.
And this was back in your hometown or home state?
This is home state.
So
this is in Georgia.
Okay.
So, but I actually worked when I worked for said unnamed large insurance company. I actually worked for the entire East Coast. So, and I was a compliance accounts receivable auditor. So I would look at irregularities and numbers. Which is interesting because my degree's in English, but I'm pretty okay at math. So that's how I got into that job. And I just noticed these trends. Like, oh, look, all these weird actuarial tables. Like, we can go hire, and we were actively hiring management from historically black colleges and stuff. It didn't change anything because the trends established by redlining had biased the statistics for so long that it still showed up in actuarial tables and probably will for another 50 years, if it ever gets out of it. And that's not even adding into compounding factors like, lack of inherited wealth and stuff like that. The fifth thing is often the structural stuff, and again, this is related to the statistics, is more pernicious, more damaging, and probably kills more people than a lot of other stuff. But since it's harder to narrativize, and harder to get a there's no some of those things, the people to blame are 100 years dead. And while liberal narratives around privilege do sort of get to some of this, it often doesn't. It's still not precise enough to really understand how the structures really got themselves into the society. And then you compound that there are still plenty of real bigots in the world who probably also are making decisions. Things get worse. But it doesn't require much. Yeah. And so a lot of the things that I see large-scale conspiracy theories try to answer are better answered and more possibly answered by structural inertia, but that's harder to narrativize. And even we know everybody likes to scream about the system, but by the system they usually mean specific people. And sometimes that's just not the case. Now, in cases of stuff this is why I pointed out with war, you can't often, that isn't the case. War is usually more actively colluded on. And so it gets very complicated. So those are my 5 rules for how you would say judge something. And so, for example, when I talk to the kid, I actually refused to talk about 9/11 because I didn't want to argue about truthers. But when people ask me about 9/11 conspiracy theories, I will say I do think there's suspicious stuff in the reports. I do think there is plenty of evidence that Saudi Arabia and maybe some other U.S. allies were involved in some way, maybe not intentionally, but maybe, and that this was papered over. I also suspect that prior U.S. incompetence in foreign policy was papered over. And I don't just mean Chalmers Johnson blowback, but just literally the Bin Ladens kind of got their start fighting, helping helping the Mujahideen in Afghanistan from a Persian Saudi Arabia to fight the Soviets, which was explicit U.S. foreign policy. So,
and setting up the Hollywood epic Rambo 3.
Oh yes, I actually bring that when I teach history. I actually talk about that to my class about why was Rambo 3 softened over, in its dedications and stuff like that.
What you see here are the Mujahideen soldiers, holy warriors. To us, this war is a holy war. And there's no true death for the Mujahideen because we have taken our last rites and we consider ourselves dead already. To us, death for our land and God is an honor.
Although we're now getting so far away from that they don't know what Rambo 3 is, so tragic.
And not that tragic. It wasn't that good.
No,
it's terrible.
Rambo 2 is where the action's
right.
at.
Well, yeah, this is a show where we did an entire episode. We just called it the Stallone Show and talked about it. But no, just the very particular weird, the weird time and place where this was a Hollywood blockbuster set in fucking 1989 Afghanistan. That even at the time, Mad Magazine was making fun of. I was like, wait, why are you shooting at the Russians? They're leaving. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's... as a side note, just it's interesting if you wanted to trace, the kind of, cynicism of, say, the baby boomers. You can trace both Rambo and Rocky from their first movie, which has they both actually have kind of proletarian... resonances to their third and fourth instantiation.
Yeah, that's the even in our episode we kind of talked about that, about how the two franchises are just small, tiny little character studies that are not I don't want to say not interested in Ash at all, but very much just have nothing to do with Cold War shit. All of a sudden you go a few years into hyper corporate Hollywood in the Reagan era and Cold War shit, and then there you go. You have rest in peace, Clubber Lang. Wait, no, right. Not Clubber Lang. Apollo Creed. My mistake.
No, rest in peace, Apollo Creed.
Yeah,
it is interesting that we got what was essentially a soft remake of Rocky with Creed, but can you imagine the meltdown that people would have if you had a modern day remake of First Blood, where a returning veteran just goes ham on some cops?
Oh, Lord. Yeah, you can't really remake First Blood anymore.
Yeah, people would freak out. It would be amazing.
Somewhere I still have a copy of a paperback of the original novel. I have no idea where I put it.
David Morrell.
Yeah, that it's somewhere we have like 10 bookshelves here, so somewhere in one of those bookshelves is that book.
Oh. Well, that book is fascinating too, but sort of not related, but those are sort of my rough rules on that. Now, I know these rules are a little bit hard to disentangle because they kind of feed into each other. But the two harder ones are the last two, which are, can you explain it using some kind of intentional or unintentional? In fact, that doesn't really matter. Can it be explained by structural inertia, either intentional or not? And can it be explained... what are you not seeing because you're not looking at statistical and numerical data? And then the other three are, if it's incompetence is usually going to be more likely to be true than malice just based off priors. If it involves less than two people, it's more likely to be true. And if there is a very clear and immediate foreign policy agenda, that does complicate things. But you can assume, for example, that the State Department is probably funneling money somewhere, and that's not even that. I don't think many people would even really contest you on that unless they're being disingenuous. We're connecting all sorts of things tonight in terms of the State Department funneling money to foreign things and, say, Central and South American exploits during the 80s. Do you remember the opening of Predator? Yes, I do. Jacob, do you?
Yeah.
Do you remember what Carl Weathers, aka Apollo Creed, played in that film?
Wasn't he a CIA guy?
Yeah, he's a CIA agent. Yeah. Layers within layers, folks. It's all coming together.
Also, you can usually assume Marvel is doing government propaganda because that's kind of what it's done since World War II.
Leading the way in innovation,
a lot of firsts have happened here.
The test and evaluation at Edwards paves the way for the Air Force.
Any aerospace system that we have now or we've had in the past comes through this location,
making it a fitting place to film a movie said to be breaking boundaries. Brie Larson stars as the first ever solo female Marvel superhero, Captain Marvel.
But,
Okay, well, now, hold on. I'm going to have to jump in here. Captain America is an extremely complex symbol that has taken on many forms under different writers. I would point, of course, most famously to his time as the hero Nomad after Watergate, where he abandoned the costume and traveled the country on a motorcycle.
Fair.
Well, and we were recording this in the midst of Captain Marvel is still in theaters, which had explicit Air Force. They had fucking flyovers on the night of the red carpet premiere.
Although, yeah, I was kind of amused by watching right-wingers get mad about that, though, because I'm like, okay, well, you didn't have a problem with that, and I don't know Top Gun. Or like every airplane movie in the 80s. But I just sort of assume those are given, and Hollywood's particularly given towards it, just kind of like cable news is given towards being bamboozled by things because it needs access to have any sort of verisimilitude. And so usually access comes with strings.
I mean, that's not really a conspiracy theory, though. It's
it's not. It's obvious.
It's structure. That is one of the things. Is like, how do you explain to somebody? And we're getting into. I think this is getting into much more into, I don't know, philosophy, psychology, or epistemology. How do you help someone start thinking in who's not used to it, and maybe is because they're not quite a leftist or something? How do you explaining to someone how to think in terms of structures and systems rather than just like direct causation?
So this is hard. System thinking is difficult to train people in, but like when I talk to kids about structural inequity, the first thing I do is bring up inheritance. All right. So let's say, I don't know, you're an upper middle class white person whose parents inherited part of their wealth, and you've inherited part of your wealth, and you know someone down the street who has the exact same income as you. Who's going to have more wealth?
The heir.
The heir. Every kid gets that. Then mention slavery. All right, and like I'm not training kids to be woke. I mean, I kind of am, but that's not actually I don't see that as my job. What I'm training them is to see, like, no, that is perfectly logical. That inheritance that you had, I don't know, a 250-year head start on. If you are of a certain social class and of a certain race. Now, unfortunately. Even when people say they think about structure, they tend to personalize it in ways that aren't helpful.
For example?
Talking about checking your privilege.
Okay, yeah.
I've always thought privilege checking was kind of irrelevant. Like, knowing that I'm privileged doesn't change pretty much anything.
Yeah, I think Phoebe Maltz-Bovey has her book. I think it's called The Perils of Privilege that she wrote. She wrote during. I think she wrote it during the 2016 election. And she's coming from a much more like left liberal side, that it's like, yeah, it's great, but like it doesn't. Okay, fine. It's almost like a form of like noblesse oblige. Like, okay, you are now like proclaiming how aware you are of something. Like, what does that change? Hang on one second. I got a cat that's demanding attention. I got to let her out. One moment.
No problem. I understand cat issues.
Unless there's a cat in the background.
I like cats personally.
Me too.
There's a movie called Cats and Dogs, which advances the theory that there's actually a massive conspiracy revolving around cats.
Oh,
interesting. They're getting up to all kinds of antics. And this is, of course, they really get into it in the sequel, Cats and Dogs 2, which I would highly recommend.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, that was... trying to remember what was it. Oh yeah, The Revenge of Kitty Galore.
Okay, that's pretty great, actually.
Yeah.
I can get behind that. Yeah.
But the thing you mentioned about the 9/11 stuff is interesting to me because I'm a JFK guy from back in the day, but I've never really been interested in who shot him or why. I've always been really interested in the investigation surrounding it, where I think you can point to a lot of really shady stuff.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's legitimately shady stuff in the Warren Commission.
But we know, for example, that high-ranking people in the CIA actually spoke to Warren and said, it would be really cool if this wasn't mentioned or that wasn't mentioned. And we know that the FBI destroyed documents relating to that.
And we also know that the autopsy wasn't done right. And, I mean, there's all kinds of issues. Which is why, like, I actually do tend to believe, like, if you were to ask me to put money down on something, I tend to believe that the Secret Service probably accidentally shot him. But, which would explain to me a lot of those inconsistencies, but I can't know. I mean, the other thing is, like, there's so many Cold War things that people tend to forget when they talk about, Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby and the CIA's involvement in that, because it is talked about in a context as if it was just a lone conspiracy, or maybe they bring up embarrassment over the Bay of Pigs or something like that, but it usually isn't really talked about properly in its Cold War context, and the kinds of auxiliary things that people would be interested in hiding. And that, I mean, I do think there's legitimate reasons to be suspicious of that kind of stuff. Just because, like, I don't know, having dealt with large scale bureaucracies, even as a socialist, I tend to see, like, all kinds of bureaucratic drift issues, and hiding things out of, like, sheer embarrassment, or hiding things not because of the direct effect that it has, but that there might be something smaller but pretty pernicious that's indirectly tied into something, and you're hiding the blowback from that. I mean, we got plenty of evidence of that in the last, I don't know, 20 years even. You don't even have to get the declassified stuff. There's just stuff that's kind of obvious about that kind of stuff. And so I don't want to I always feel strange because a lot of people see me as an anti-conspiracy thinker, and when it comes to stuff like Alex Jones or like hard trutherism, I am. But on the, like, this kind of, like, if you listen to something like Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, there is sort of a tendency to just kind of trust government reports that I think is kind of an overcorrection, in a way that's probably pretty dangerous.
Yeah, on a similar note, connected to something you mentioned, how do you help folks be okay, if this is at all possible? It's another thing is, like, how do you help someone be or feel okay with, or be able to handle the ambiguity of, like, at some point, there's just shit we can't, we will never be able to know. And yeah, that kind of sucks, but at the same time, it's like, the sun's still going to come tomorrow, and there's still shit we need, we still need to mow the lawn. There are still cats to be fed. There's still stuff we got to do, and we just have to continue life with this ambiguity, this gap in the narrative.
Well, I mean, that's really hard, and structural thinking there actually doesn't always help. Because one of the things that I've noticed on the left is we tend to typologize things in ways that also make irregularities or systemic inconsistencies not matter. Like, we tend to, you can talk about, you'll have people talk about specific mechanisms for something like the decline rate of profits. I believe in that, whatever. Or something like that. But then when there's any kind of disconfirming anything, they jump to such a high level of abstraction that you don't have to deal with it. So systems thinking isn't always going to be your answer to that. I always just like to just point out that like, there, not to get all like conspiracy theories monger in this quantum woo stuff, but there is certain sense to certain thought experiments, like the Schrodinger's cat experiment, for example. There is no actual answer to that.
Yeah, it's almost like a Zen Cohen. Cohen?
Yeah.
Leonard Cohen.
It's like Cohen, but Japanese, not Jewish. But yeah, it's
unless you are Leonard Cohen, who at one point was a Zen monk.
Well, it happens.
Yep. Anyway, sorry. Pardon my interruption. I had to get that joke in.
But yeah, I don't know. I haven't changed my strategy in a lot of this. Honestly, I used to be guns out. I used to come guns out blazing, left wing shitlord sort of approach to a lot of the stuff. And lately, I have been doing this thing where I do Rogerian arguments, where I try to find the 2 or 3 things I can grant someone as a shared understanding, and then systemically pull away.
Quick background. Did you say Rogerian argument?
Yeah, like the psychologist Rogers. So Rogerian argument.
Okay, cool. I didn't know the name.
Yeah, so it's where you ground as much of the counter argument as you can for 2 reasons. One is the heuristic of charity. So if you beat someone with a stronger argument, you have you've won. And I know that part of what's hurt this is a lot of right wingers have started using this as rhetoric. They actually don't do Rogerian arguments. A lot of their arguments are totally in bad faith, but they say they do. So granting anybody any kind of ground premise to argue on becomes almost impossible. And frankly, our own tendency towards ideological or narrative, either one, consistency can be a problem here, because granting the initial arguments can feel like a betrayal. And so, but that means you really can't, if you start out with that model or objective, convincing people is impossible, because to even talk to you, they already have to accept all your premises, which they're not going to do.
Yeah. But that's been one of my own issues of trying to explain, just talking to folks about being able to handle ambiguity and just the not knowing, and just in trying not to do the carpet bomb of, like I said, guns blazing, or even go. I'm not. Thank God I've never gone to. I wasn't raised in the later era, the YouTube era, where so many kids saw all these like Ainsley McCree talks about this, about how many, because so many kids saw all these debunking and skeptic videos from a lot of people who went on to become either full on asshole libertarian or alt-right types. And
or went through both. I mean, you think of the case of Pat Condell or even Sargon of Akkad. Both came out of that world. I mean, look, I kind of come out of that world, so...
time and place, folks. Time and place.
Yeah, I mean, I was even weirder, and I went the complete opposite spectrum. I started off kind of a scary right-winger, went through a period, not of libertarian, but in that kind of skeptics community debunking phase, which weirdly actually led me to socialism. I was an odd man out of that one. And then sort of woke up and noticed that half those people were quasi-alt-rightist, and Less Wrong had, the site Left Wrong had gone insane. And and people were misusing genetic arguments to talk about sociology and
weird Sam Harris shit.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about advocates for Bays and stuff, I guess the big people would be Yudkowsky, and there's a historian named Richard Carrier who's a big advocate.
Yeah, I know Richard Carrier's work, and actually, of the kind of skeptics world, Richard Carrier is not that bad. But I should be careful that there might be something terrible he's done that I don't know about.
He's an accused sex pest, I guess. I don't know if that counts, but
well, yeah, that's pretty terrible. But isn't that? Never mind. I won't say that. I don't want to
back away slowly.
Everyone in that community, but that seems to be somewhat endemic, even for Merce. I mean, look, left-wing nerd community is actually endemic with sex pests too.
Well,
but
to Carrier's credit, he seems to limit his skepticism to the religious fields largely.
Yeah, and not even all of them. He's actually very limited to stuff about ancient Mediterranean, because that's his field of study.
Sure.
He at one point he said he was a Taoist. I don't think he still goes by that, but I know that in his before he got his PhD. Now we're going on a deep nerd train. The thing is, I've been part of this culture. I see myself as coming out of it, and I also, I can talk a little bit about myself, and this is one thing I do to convince people. You will notice that I've granted the viability of a lot of small conspiracies that people may or may not believe, and that their doubts are legitimate. And the other thing is, I also come out of that community, and so does one of my colleagues at Zero. I mean, Douglas Lane started off as kind of a hard truther, and over time in study, became sort of a soft truther, so to speak, or not even a truther, just like the 9/11 Commission report has a lot of stuff that it's obviously hiding, probably.
Yeah.
Obviously, probably.
Well, that is kind of the thing. It's like at some point, it's almost like reassuring people that, yeah, you are in court. Like I said, we'll bring up Corey Pine talking about how a lot of like the online, the really like prominent online, the ones who aren't overt grifters are, well, before of course they, eventually and a lot of them wind up drifting into the area of starting to believe their own shtick, because that's, you fake, it's very much fake it until you make it, or fake it and fake confidence until you are confident. Same thing.
Yeah. Drink your own Kool-Aid, so to speak. But I mean, everybody. That's a tendency of all things too, not just conspiracy theorists.
Oh yeah. And it's, I can remember, people would say, I remember reading about this. People talking about George Carlin near the end of his life was that because his shtick was this kind of was a very particular affect that he would put on stage, and eventually it just kind of like it seeped in a bit too much, and kind of like curdled a lot. I'm kind of curious exactly what like George Carlin would be like now, if he would have gone like gone like late stage comedian who runs out of material and is just cranky, which I don't think he wasn't quite. I don't think he never was like that kind of like. You're smiling, Jacob. What?
I'm just imagining the 7 words that you can't say on YouTube.
Oh, that doesn't make me feel good.
Yeah. It's the tendency of, acknowledging that people, that there are, it's almost like validating their uncertainties or their doubts that, yeah, there's something particularly fucked up here, but it's at some point it's like handling the scale of what comes into because like everybody needs to fill the gap. Nature and our own kind of like self narratives abhor vacuums, and something has to fill that gap. Otherwise, you can't have a three-legged you can't have a three-legged square table. You need that fourth leg there to support this whole structure. And so you're going to come up with something like it's kind of like treading on, taking tender steps to acknowledge that, yeah, your feelings that something is very off here is valid, but there is a lot of times people either overcorrect or just kind of amplify their speculation about what could this possibly be.
One of the things is you have to get people to divorce, and this is psychology flat out. This is not logic.
Right.
To divorce themselves from their terror management. And that's hard. I mean, like, that is really, really hard. And I don't just encourage that with, like, conspiracy theorists. I actually encourage it with left-wingers. Like, every left-winger should imagine on a regular basis what the null hypothesis to every one of their beliefs are, which even the moral ones, which makes people really uncomfortable. Like, what if your moral beliefs actually lead to more suffering in the world? Now, I'm not saying you need to believe that, but you need to entertain what it would look like if it was true, because that's going to be your beginnings of being able to test the validity of your own ideology. And I get into hard fights with a lot of my comrades, to use that silly word that we leftists tend to use. I tend to be... My favorite non-gendered word for people is peeps, which has, no strong historical association other than with marshmallow ducks, or chickens, or whatever they are. They're peeps.
It varies by the season, but yes.
The focus here has to be on, you have to grant that you could be wrong on pretty much everything. In fact, I tend to think that, like, ideological effectiveness and the inability to betray is that, like, an unwillingness to betray your cause is actually somewhat based in being willing to admit you could be wrong. When I've seen people who are the most hard-line true believers on an ideological way in, like, left-wing causes, and I can think of 3 or 4 people I've worked with who then flipped to be rightist. And they were 100% sure of one thing, and then, that kind of sort of starts to crack a little bit, and they completely break, and they're 100% through of the opposite thing, And those people are dangerous. So just heads up. Like, they're dangerous to the movement, they're dangerous to themselves, but it's also, like, that kind of ideological certainty is actually really fragile, because if you can convince yourself of that much of any one thing, all you have to do is change a parameter and you can change everything else.
Yeah. Does that explain the kind of neocon switch that we had from guys like Christopher Hitchens and a bunch of other neocons who went from, they were 70s Trotskyists.
Some of them were, yeah. The neocon grandfathers were a weird mixture of 70s Trotskyists and Straussians, like Leo Straussians, which they weren't really the same people at first, but yes, I think that explains. You also see in France with Maoists, a lot of Maoists flipped and became conservatives in France for similar reasons.
It's they kept the same intensity, only that compass needle drifted a little bit to the side.
I'm going to name names here, actually. My former friend Michael Rettenwald, who was literally my chosen successor at the No Star, who now, his last interview, he was one of the last interview guests on Bill O'Reilly, and semi-regular on Tucker Carlson, has written 2 books about how, the left wing sucks and social justice warriors are evil.
Jeez.
He was one of those people who was almost, he had found the true religion of Marxism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he saw Marxism as opposed to liberal social justice. And, when the Marxists didn't go with him in his completely in his anti-social justice, point of views, he completely flipped. And everything changed. Everything else he believed in changed, He went from opposing capitalism to totally supporting it. And you do see his story. David Horowitz, kind of a neocon too. He was a Maoist, by the way. Did the same thing.
Well, I don't want to call you out, but didn't you say you started out?
I started out in the right wing. Yeah.
So, didn't you make the same transition then?
Not really. Because it wasn't. I didn't actually wake up one day and discover myself to be a Marxist.
So what you're saying is that it's one of the issues there is that the speed with which they flip. Is that what you're?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So for me, what I can go into that a little bit. I have always, there are a couple of values that I have that I think kind of have even deeper than, say, my belief in Marxism. I've always been distrustful of foreign wars. I've tended to see them as a business conspiracy. Not entirely, and I've lessened on this actually as a left-winger, because I had another way to explain it. When I was a right-winger, I really didn't have a way to explain it except for as, profiteering conspiracies.
Well, that was also, that also had something to do with your particular background, where you grew up and.
Oh, yeah. I grew up in Georgia, and I dealt with some Marxists. They were a part of International Answer, and they were kind of diehard. And this, those were in the days where, because I started out actually kind of as a Marxist. And so maybe you could say that I did this and then undid it. When I was a teenager, I read Chomsky. I read a bunch of. I was in the zine world.
Life in the 90s, folks. Yep, that was the 90s.
Yep. I really, really, really was a hardcore. I actually the only time that I had ever gone to the West Coast at all, before I was in my late 20s, again later, was to go to the Battle of Seattle when I was 18.
Nice.
And I was, I was kind of a college anarcho-communist. A college high school anarcho-communist. I was actually in high school when that happened, just finishing it. And I was so turned off by what I saw there. I know this sounds strange to us now because we tend to see a lot of, but I saw Pat Buchanan, that thing, or people are associated with him. And then in 2001, the 9/11 happened, and then but 2003, when the second G8 happened, I was still kind of in the anti-globalization movement, but the only people who showed up were kind of the International Answer people, and the variety that I dealt with there were pretty ML, Marxist-Leninist, kind of soft Stalinist-y, and, had a little bit of a boner for North Korea, That
hey, there's at least a couple of those types still hanging around Portland because they apparently they showed up to a local like cross tendency leftist group meeting like a year and a half ago or something, and actually had from all reports they busted out prepared speeches. One of them it did involve like actually explicitly calling for the support of North Korea. So
yeah, I mean these people were also supporting some regimes I thought were pretty right wing too. Like they were not just like keep the military off of Ahmadinejad, but maybe that they're right.
I mean, standing for North Korea is probably a pretty smart move these days. You could get an ambassadorship.
Oh yeah, funnily enough, like I also opposed war with North Korea, but I didn't feel like I needed to make apologetics to do that.
Yeah, I was going to say, but a key bit there, I think, because you mentioned the word, because they really were, that word was tossed around, anti-globalism, and anti-globalist protesters, and it's kind of a thing where it's funny how that particular word has kind of like been, has permutated in the last 20 years.
Well, the funny thing about that, that's not new. So one of the things that I traced down, I listened to and have been in discussion with, Dan, I can't remember his last name, of the Knowledge Fight podcast, they literally track Alex Jones. And I remember first encountering Alex Jones, I must have been right after 9/11, because I've known about him for a long time, since before Waking Life came out.
Yeah, I think Waking Life would have been my first exposure.
And that's funny to me because, well, part of it's because I come from this kind of right-wing milieu, so I knew about him. But I remember tracking down that tactic had been used to adopt anti-globalism language since the Rocky Mountain. What's that? What's the
Ruby Ridge?
No, it was right after Ruby Ridge, where all the kind of right-wing groups met together. It's the Rocky Mountain something. It was in Colorado. It's shortly after Ruby Ridge happened.
So it would have been like 94, but before 95.
Right, and it's Rocky Mountain Renaissance. I can't remember what there's a name for it in these circles, but
now, what exactly is a Rocky Mountain Rendezvous?
It was a mixture of like militia movements, the Klan,
all the hits. Yeah,
and they met outside Colorado, and they explicitly adopted both leaderless resistance movements, which was kind of a left-wing thing at one point, even though we don't think about it now.
Yeah, did they do twinkle fingers and 5-hour meetings?
No, leaderless resistance movements is funny because, like, yes, that language was adopted in Occupy, but you know what it was actually used for?
What?
Left-wing terror cells. Because leaderless resistance people can't betray each other. Even under torture, they don't know enough to betray. You can't build a movement out of it, but if all you want to do is like blow stuff up, it's pretty effective. And they also started using globalism language to try to get disaffected middle class, maybe even left leaning people who maybe had a problem, more uncomfortable with brown people, on their side. So this isn't new at all. I mean, in fact, it's as old as neither left nor right as a slogan, which is an explicit fascist thing. Now, it's never been all that effective, but I'll give you another example of that, how it kind of got into that right-wing world. I was on a Rage Against the Machine listserv that I would get on at my high school. In the late 90s.
Kids, the 90s was a very particular time that at some point, I think Doug really needs to do like, as much as how like late 60s, early 70s radical movements are getting re-examined now, we really need to do a full-on re-examination of just the particular like fucking weird and hopeless and just strange, like just bad politics and weird cultural formations that was like the American 90s left and culture there too.
So you got on this listserv.
Yeah, anyway, sorry, go on.
No, you got on this listserv, right? And you would see people for free Leon Peltier and free Mumbai Abdul Jamal, and also like Ruby Ridge was fucked up, which actually, as a side note, it was.
Yeah.
But like, you get into this world where you're like, wait, I came here for the Mumbai Abdul Jamal, but these kind of Alex Jonesy peripheral people were tied into that. And I mean, it was really, I think it was really until about 2 years before Trump that you would still have Alex and, RT, and I used to actually comment on this, like Webster Tarpley and a lot of, the paleocons who published at Counterpunch, and even kind of the sketchier end of of Cockburn's politics, where they would flirt with these sort of like right-wing conspiracy people, like Justin Raimondo or Lou Rockwell would, go and talk to Bill Moyers.
Lou Rockwell, Jesus.
So I got into that world. Like, I was never a Lou Rockwellite, because I wasn't a libertarian. But someone gave me a republic, not an empire, and I didn't catch all the dog whistles in it. I was just like, yeah, this is a coherent anti-war statement. We don't need empires. Yeah. And so I kind of got into the antiwar.com, Scott Horton, who I actually still kind of respect even though he was a libertarian nut. That world of anti-war movement, because the left-wing world was doing stuff trying to make apologia for Ahmadinejad, or at least the part that I dealt with. Actually, it wasn't that common, but I just ran into those people. And I just slowly got sucked into that world. They used the same globalism language, right?
Right.
They were a lot of times at the time they would talk about human biodiversity, which was originally a left-wing, that's code for race realism now. It has been since the middle of the aughts, but in the 90s that was a left-wing call to respect tribal life and give people local autonomy. And as a person who thought I was ethical, I got in there's a right-wing articulation of this. And I didn't even really realize, when I call myself a right-winger, I mean, I did, by the time I was, 24, I thought of myself as a right-winger, actually, the anti-war right. But any time in between that, I actually didn't even really realize until after the fact how far right I'd gone. And what turned me off was a couple of things. I started fading out of it around the housing crisis because the libertarian economics and the nationalist economics didn't make any sense about how they were explaining that to me. And the other thing was being a teacher. When I got out of the insurance world and got into being a teacher, I started seeing a side of society again that I grew up in that, but I kind of, when you're college educated and you are fairly privileged even if you're poor. You forget things, and that sort of slowly woke me back up. So the process of it took me about 2 or 3 years to end up on the right wing, and about 2 or 3 years to get out. And I was kind of just in the wilderness for a long time. I was beginning to read Marx again around 2007, right around the economic collapse. The Great Recession,
right?
And, because I was reading both Austrian and Keynesian analysis of what was happening, and neither one rang true to me. And I knew enough about economics to know that I really didn't know, from any of the theories that I've been given, how to explain what was going on.
I think that's one of the oldest from that era. That one of the oldest videos. Actually, even before, not even a vlog, but it was a little video essay by Professor Richard Wolff, of all things, that I think he did with either Abby Martin's group or something, talking about how helping to bring in a Marxist explanation for all of the 2008 NH shit that I've encountered.
Funnily enough, I actually have JG is. Still kind of follows Abby. I don't. But that was actually part of my transition out. But it also made me aware, my transition out also made me aware of how much, inroads have been made by the right into the left, because I actually been snagged up in that. And so, I grew up in a kind of anti-political household. My mother was a nurse, a waitress turned nurse, and, kind of a social democrat, and my stepfather was a conservative on law and justice issues, and not necessarily the most woke person on earth, but believed in socialized medicine even in the 90s. And when he was voting for Ross Perot. So
1992, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so like that's the world I kind of came out of, and that's different. I mean, I don't know a lot of left wingers with that, so I wouldn't say, I wouldn't say that I like flipped from right to left. I would say I kind of did embody that over cocksure confidence in the left, and then when the slightest bit of disappointment crept in my teens, I flipped without even realizing it, and then sort of reality snuck back up on me. But a lot of people can insulate themselves from reality pretty hard. And this is one of the reasons why I don't always trust my own analysis of things, even though, I get asked to come in and speak like authoritatively on a lot of stuff, because I have been wrong, like utterly wrong in the past. And what was interesting about that is my kind of moral valences didn't change much from going from the left to the right to the left again. It was my explanation for the moral valences to change, which does mean that like I tend to think this idea that we have no shared values at all to build upon when we talk to people who disagree with us. It's just not true. That actually makes us feel better about our own awareness, I think, than it's actually a representation of how you actually should be approaching people.
Gotcha. Jacob, response?
Well, I think one of the things that I find that kind of complicates that, though, is that I think you can deal with people who have a very well thought out, articulated moral framework, but it is one that is based on premises that are just fundamentally incompatible with yours.
And, oh yeah, I mean that happens, but I often think that the articulations are more incompatible than the root emotions. All right, so like most people are. I mean, even conservatives. I don't trust all of Jonathan Haidt's research on this.
It's probably a smart move.
Yeah, I don't, because it's based on self-reporting and it claims to work in any society, which is crazy. Like, because what is left and right actually is pretty historically specific. But like approaches to fairness, I actually can make inroads with libertarians on, particularly on war issues. And then usually they have a very abstract notion of property. And I used to hammer away at this. I used to try to hammer away at it logically. Most libertarians have Lockean assumptions about the justification of property, but they talk about like non-aggression principles and all that. And what you notice is that when you point out that their Lockean assumptions about use is just not true. Like historically, it's provably not true. We didn't all just agree from land use to the rights to our property. Like it was privatized. And even like John Locke was writing at the time in which that happened, so he knew it.
Yeah.
And
not to mention he was across the water from where a very particular form of land acquisition was actively happening for a good couple centuries.
Yeah, and also he wrote the Constitution of South Carolina justifying both that and slavery. Just
It's funny how that works. History is fun. History is fun, folks. That's all we gotta say.
So, this isn't the John Locke hate hour. I think leftists should actually take a very dialectical, nuanced view of Locke, but you have to deal with that. And I would chip away at that. And you know what I learned? I wasn't convincing people who I was arguing with, but I was convincing people who were watching who I was arguing with.
Yeah, that's
as long as I didn't cyberbully them. If I cyberbullied them, I lost people. Like it would just automatically turn people off. I would automatically be the bad guy, which is funny because cyberbullying gets a pretty high short-term return. Like you'll always get likes doing it, but it tends to turn people off, even who are inclined to agree with you.
Maybe you didn't bully them enough. Maybe if you had destroyed them with facts and logic, it would have gone better.
Yeah, if you talk to Ben Burgess, have you guys talked to Ben yet?
No, I'm not. I want to talk to him before or right as his book hits.
Yeah, Ben and I, we were at a conference in Idaho, and we hung out, and we talked a lot about this, about using logic. And Ben's more of both Ben and I are actually kind of logic nerds, like formal logic nerds. It was part of my education. But we kind of disagree on how effective it is.
Yeah, Ben is. That's the funny thing about that lecture video is you can hear. God, what the fuck was it? October of last year, it was the Jordan Peterson response to Jordan Peterson conference.
It was a response to Jordan Peterson turning down a debate that he agreed to with Doug Lane, and then he disagreed to it because he didn't think Doug was big enough.
Didn't they originally weren't they originally trying to get Zizek to do that one?
Well, yeah. Well, the Zizek Jordan Peterson debate was kind of pressured by Doug, but originally it was Doug asked Peterson to come and talk to him because he said that no Marxist will debate me. Doug was like, I'll be that Marxist. Originally Peterson's agent said yes. Then they backed out later because Doug wasn't big enough, and then they were like, okay, we'll get Zizek, and then she kind of said yes and it kind of said no, and apparently that's happening now.
That sounds like the sort of thing that Zizek would say.
Well, yeah, I mean, Zizek's getting up there, man. He's I don't know. He's not doing all that hot.
He's not healthy these days. No. He's got. I think was it confirmed Bell's palsy or something.
Yeah.
But
I just wanted to mention on that because I think that was the very first time that I ever the video of Ben's lecture there. Had you guys talked to him at all before that, or was that the first time everybody met him that you all met?
I think Doug had talked to him, but I met him. I met him like a few, literally, I think a couple of hours before that.
Yeah,
it was, or maybe the night. It was the night we met, like the night before. Like I had just flown into Idaho, and I've been hanging out with Doug, and Michael Brooks was there too. And I think you can hear both of our voices in that video.
Yeah, there's if you listen to it, I can cue in a little bit, or at least put a link to it. The video of Ben's lecture there.
Strategically, I mean, I think Brooks and I have different answers on this actually, but how do you play off of that tension without platforming concern? And I say this as a person who does it because I'll talk on Peter Hitchens exactly on that point. Like there's these Catholic reactionaries, and if you fight Peterson with their arguments, it's actually easier to hit him than with ours.
Sure.
But at what point? I mean, like, how do you use that strategically? Is what I'm asking. Like, how can you actually play that out? Because we're not those guys either. We don't actually think that we don't even think it's possible that you could go back to normal traditional family norms of the 19th century invented traditions.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if Michael wants to respond to that also, because I'd be curious about his thoughts. But I guess I would say that if the goal isn't to make Jordan Peterson fans Peter Hitchens fans, right? Like that's not it's not totally clear to me that that's that's a move that's forward, or at least very much forward.
But no, it's just I just was deeply amused because I was watching the video. I'm like, hey, wait a minute, I know who at least two of these people are just by their voice alone, and it's still trying to get once and all, like, because I'm on Michael Brooks's Discord trying to get him to like have you on his show, because I think it'd be really funny both to have you like talk to Griscom, but also to kind of expose you to that audience. Anyway, this is
it's funny because apparently there's a fan that Michael's contacted me about it a few times. Like he swears it's going to happen one day, but we're always trying to figure out what I'm going to talk about that's not going to start a fight. So
good luck.
I'm also in conversations. I think I'll be interviewing Jamie from Antifada soon, so we'll see how that goes too.
That'd be kind of cool. The at some point, if you ever know anybody, well, I mean, you were an English major, weren't you? Yeah.
Yes, I was. English and anthropology, English and anthropology and philosophy.
Gothic Marxism is becoming a thing again. Jacob, you look bored.
No.
Oh, okay, just checking.
I'm just not in the Michael Brooks Discord.
I'm surprised. I think you'd enjoy it.
Why? There are a lot of memes?
Well, it's in a certain extent, but also responding to both his and Sam's shows in real time. because it's one of those things where like at least Michael's like half of especially like on Sam Cedar show, like half the staff are on the, are like actively like in the Discord, and you can mention stuff in there that'll pop up on the show, which is kind of it's a nice little trick. But that was a nice little video, and I am trying to get. The fun thing about Ben Burgess is that he's effectively. I think we both grew up maybe about an hour apart, because he's about my age and he's from East Lansing.
Oh yeah, he and we're all the same age. As for your listeners to know, we're all, well, you're like what, a couple years older than me. Ben and I are almost the exact same age.
Yeah.
So,
trying to get him and Rob Larson, who is teaching up in Tacoma, who's been trying to do a thing to come down and do like a book thing at Powell's down here, but they try to get that together, and it's not really happening. But still, have him come down and give a talk for everybody from local like DSA folks and everybody else too. I was going to try to like set that up at some point, but who knows when that's going to happen.
To be concluded on the next episode of Giving the Mic to the Wrong Person.